Notice I don't have a PowerPoint. That's on purpose. I'm just going to talk to you guys for 20 minutes. If you feel sleepy, feel free to take a nap. But essentially, what am I going to talk about? The reason I'm not doing a PowerPoint for multiple reasons. One, I didn't develop one. Two, I did not want to be a slave to a PowerPoint. Because if I have a PowerPoint, I have to follow the PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint is the power. And I have no points left. So the idea is just to talk to you. And the paper that you see, the title of the paper, actually the paper is already published. It just came out about 2 months ago in the RELC journal. And it's a special issue on world Englishes. So actually the paper itself you can read. And I think the paper itself is probably more readable than I can talk in 20 minutes. There's no way I can give my paper in 20 minutes. It takes 20 pages to write it, like 9,000 words or something, right? So instead I'll do this. I'll tell you what world English is, how I see world English is, what I see world English is to be, where I see issues of dynamicity, where I see issues of power differential, and where I see world English has something to contribute to empowering our communities. Okay. Now that is really the history of world Englishes, right? Raj Kachu did not write on Indian English out of nowhere. There is a particular socio-political environment in which the work evolved. And the most important and significant part of it is essentially the shift from the British colonization of South Asia to so-called independence of South Asia. Now I'm calling it so-called for various reasons, and I'll explain this. So Raj Kachu's work in Indian English was essentially a way of saying, it's looking at post-colonization, that we are living in a world where we are no longer dictated by the British or the English, and therefore we don't need to be dictated by the norms of English that they have developed either. So move away from it. So essentially, it's a movement of empowerment. And many of the presentations here have been talking about it. And yet, at the point in time where we are in world English's history, world English history, because we are still part of it, it's growing and it's going to change. We are at a point in time where I find very often that world English's literature has stagnated, and we often have forgotten the very purpose of why we do what we do, which is empowerment of the communities. And part of it is we get involved in essentially thinking about world Englishes in nationalistic terms. Thinking of Malaysian English, Chinese English, Filipino English, and we've written about it and we can debate on that. But that's perhaps something I'm happy to do it later on. But then if we're not going to look at language in terms of nation states, we need some other way of looking at it, right? Because how do we think of language if it's not in terms of naming it in relation to a nation state or a country? And that's where I've been working on. That's really my agenda, is to think about how do we plot and create a way of understanding language that is not grounded on an understanding of nationality or ethnicity. Okay? If you take that out of the equation, then there is some chance that we can empower ourselves through language. And I'm saying language, not English anymore, and that's on purpose. Okay? Because essentially when we talk about world Englishes, world Englishes don't exist in isolation. They're part of our linguistic ecology. And they're part of our ways in which we make meaning. And now how do we do it, and how do we understand language? That's essentially the crucial thing. Now, if you look at the paper itself, when you get a chance, I talk about 3 types of variations in the paper. I talk about formal and structural variations, which are studied in world Englishes, which is what I will focus on today. I talk about semantic variation, drawing on work by linguists like Ruqayya Hassan and Michael Halliday and others. And then I look at dynamic systems theory, work that is coming out by like Diane Larson-Freeman and her colleagues, who are developing new ways of looking at dynamic systems, applying dynamic system theories to understanding language. So looking at dynamicity of language itself. So the model of variation that I sort of think of is pretty easy, and that's what I kind of like about it. It's easy to conceptualize and understand. It's essentially about us. It's about you and me, right? Language doesn't exist outside you and me. If we don't exist, language doesn't exist. So the key thing, one of the first things that we have to acknowledge and respect is who we are. That is the users, right? Users of a language are people who make language. And if we study language as if it exists outside of, independent of users, That's sort of a weird thing to do, right? I mean, you don't have language if you don't exist. So why is it that we can, right? Why do we study language as if the person doesn't exist? It's the same sort of thing. You know, educational policies, we talk about policies, but we don't talk about the students' lives. How can you create these things without looking at the person? So the first thing that I consider is important, the most important thing when we look at social sciences or in languages or social science are people, the users. Now in terms of language variation, we can think of it in terms of how users vary language based on whether they have low social distance or whether they have high social distance. Now, if you look at low social distance and high social distance, what it really means is, imagine this, you talking to your friends. Now, if you're talking to your friends and you have a shared language with them, say, let's say it's Filipino or Tagalog or Cebuano or Visayas or some other language, you know, Mandarin, whatever the language might be, then you will use those languages. If you have more than one language, you will use more than one language because it's a low social distance relationship. You are familiar with it. Think of it this way, couple talk. When couples talk, they have their private language of love or whatever it is. They call each other by cute names. They have these little code words that they use with each other, have particular meanings. If somebody else hears them, they won't actually understand what's happening because other people have high social distance. Right, so for example, the kind of language I'm using here right now is more in relation to a high social distance. Partly because it's a formal context, I don't know everybody, we don't have a lot of shared personal histories. And therefore, if I use low language that would be by low social distance, there might be one or two people here who will understand me, like her, if I speak a bit in Urdu, because she shares that language. So high social distance and low social distance tells us how we create variations in language, how we change language based on who we are with and what we are talking about with these people. Now the second dimension is the second dimension of mode. Now in some of my current work, I actually don't like the notion of mode, but I still use it. Now mode, in typical ways of thinking about mode, we think about it in terms of writing, right, and speaking, or oral. Now I prefer not to think of it as writing or as spoken. I like to prefer talking about it as written like and oral like. Now why I do this is because it's not about language being written or spoken. It's about the features of language that are reflective of more written language or oral language. So my language right now, even though I'm speaking to you, is more written like, partly because of the linguistic choices that I'm making, the kind of constructions that I have, the kind of nominalizations that I'm using. My linguistic features determine that my language is more written like rather than oral like. Whereas if you think of a play, right, you read a play, it's actually written and it's published, but you read it, it's supposed to be spoken like, right? So not confusing the mode with writing and speaking to more like written like and speaking, spoken like, oral like. The third dimension in the three-dimensional model is the use. So what use are the users putting the language to? Now the 2 points I put here is more like everyday language, and specialized language, specialized, technicalized. Now, a specialized technicalized language is the language of linguistics. It's the linguistics of language of psychology. It's the language of engineering. It's the language of biology. Anything, any specialization that you get into is a specialized technicalized language. And everyday language is the sort of the stuff you talk about at coffee breaks, right? And in the sessions, you have the technicalized language. Now, these variations can put together into 8 domains, essentially, and this is where we'll start to see how it relates to world languages. So, if you've got 3 dimensions and 2 points, endpoints for each, you can turn them into 8 combinations. There's only 8 possible combinations. So you can have low social distance, right? Everyday and oral like, right? What else can you have? Low social distance, everyday, written like, right? What else can you have? Low social distance, oh sorry, LSD. Specialized, technicalized. right? So that's domain 1, 2, 3, 4. These are not hierarchical. Okay, I number them just for convenience. They're not a hierarchy. There's no hierarchy here, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Then what else can you have?
High social distance.
Essentially, high social distance goes through. So you have everyday, specialized, technicalized, specialized, technicalized, and your oral, written, right? 8 domains. Now, think about language and where you learn language. Every human being, now this is a big generalization. Every human being, regardless of what language they develop or learn, they always learn it in this context. There is no other possibility. Why? Because you learn language with your care providers, parents, care providers, grandparents, uncles, aunts, siblings. No social distance. You talk about everyday sort of stuff. And it starts off orally or through sign language if people are, but that comes later. Oral life, right? So that's for everybody in the world. Now, the language of education is 5 and 6. Why? Because pick up any English language textbook. The purpose is you want to interact with people outside your community, right? Because if you're just learning the language of your community, you can't use that language for higher education, you can't use it for education because, or you can't talk to people you don't know because they don't have the shared local language. Therefore, you need a shared language, which is a high social distance language, to be able to interact and communicate with people you don't know very well. Easy stuff, right? So we go from somehow here to here. Now, if you're able to achieve this, you are seen as a sort of a person who has global mobility, can move around, talk to things, do things, engage with people. But this doesn't mean that you can do the kind of work that we do in academia. We need 7 and 8, which is highly technicalized and specialized. That's the conference papers. Those are disciplinary things. Now, power in knowledge construction lies here. Okay, people learn and develop language here. Power lies here. How do you get from here to here? And if you don't get here, you don't get to be a contributor to knowledge production, especially 8. Now 7 can be slightly, now think of it this way. How many people are at this conference? Say, let's say 200 people, how many presentations were there at this conference? I don't know, let's say 200 conference papers. Of those 200 presentations, all of them were in domain 7 because they are specialized discourses. But how many of those papers can actually be published in a top-tier journal? What happens whereby people who can speak this variety of language, this variation of language in an academic context, cannot write it? So in this sense, when you look at the top-tier journals, you essentially get, people cannot get published if they don't have the language here. This is why people in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, when they send papers to top-tier journals, they're often rejected. Now, people in these countries often think there's racism against them. There isn't. It's not about who you are, it's about the language. Now, this becomes a burden. Now, there's a couple of other things. How much time do I have? Okay, I just need to hear. Now, this is becoming interesting because now we can see things that how do we study different kind of Englishes? This is world Englishes. World Englishes looks at variations in language in small communities, right? To a degree, world Englishes is this. But this is also dialectology. Dialectology does exactly the same thing. Any kind of a study of language that focuses on variations in language across communities, whether it is across English-speaking communities or other communities, is here. What we do in this context is known as English for specific purposes, or LSP, language for specific purposes, right? That's what we have. This is stuff typically, the typical pedagogical grammar that you find in textbooks are based on descriptions of high social distance, everyday written like language. That's the form where you get the grammar, standard grammar from. This stuff is ELF. English is a lingua franca. It's the high social distance, everyday oral communication, people interacting with each other from different parts of the world. So what you sort of see here is that there's different, not just that there are different variations in language, we as people who study language or we who work in linguistics actually focus on different aspects of variations and we call them our specializations. And we don't often talk to each other. So people who do genre study don't talk to world Englishes. People who do world Englishes don't often talk to health for various reasons, right? No, I'm just kidding. But notice there is a gap. Gap is here. Who studies this stuff? Low social distance, specialized language. This is the language of community empowerment that nobody studies. Now let me tell you why, what happens. You guys know the world developing countries, right? You know about developing countries? Right? Philippines is considered to be a developing country, Pakistan is considered to be a developing country. And you know, actually, I'm going to put this other way around. Developing countries. Right? And then there are developed countries, right? Right? And there is a process of development, right? Right? Is that right? Is that what you're all taught? We're all taught this. We're all taught this stuff. Right? We have developing countries who need development to become developed. Right? Now, just for a second, look at it in relation to language variation. Where is the developed world in terms of knowledge construction in language? Domain 7 and 8. Comes 7 and 8. Where are the local communities, the developing communities? At 3 and 4 perhaps. Perhaps. Usually it's 1 and 2. But there might be 3 and 4. There might be, but we don't know because we don't study it. Now, we believe that if we learn 7 and 8, if people at Ateneo and De La Salle and across the universities in Philippines and across the universities in Pakistan and everywhere in the world can learn domain 7 and 8, they will become empowered. But how can they do this when it is not something that is developed intrinsically within their own communities? When it's something that is developed here, how is it that people in this community can do this? It becomes almost an impossibility. Almost. There are few people who can cross this gap, and those people become poster boys and poster girls, right? Because they have succeeded where others cannot. So, and they're seen as models like, if this person can succeed, so can you. But it creates a myth of development. I prefer not to look at this. I think these are bad terms. Bad terms. Because what you're doing is you're setting up something that you can never achieve. You're always turning it to something that you can never achieve, instead of respecting what you have. You know why? Because it's not a process of developed or developing. These are exploiting communities. Exploiting communities. There are exploited communities. Notice I'm not saying exploiting countries. They're exploited communities. It's a community within anywhere. So there are exploiting communities within the Philippines that lead to exploited communities. There are exploiting communities in Australia that lead to exploited communities within Australia, including Aboriginal communities, but not just Aboriginal communities. And this process is this directional, not going up, and it's a process of exploitation. And language plays a key role in it, because we sustain 7 and 8. We create 7 and 8, and we try to achieve it. Now, so what are the ways through which we can actually try to resist this process of development and resist this process of exploitation? We don't want this, right? We don't want to be exploited. But if we stay dependent on this stuff, then how do we escape it? The only way that I see of escaping it is empowering 3 and 4. 3 and 4. This is stuff we don't know. We don't know about the communities. Why? Why is this empowering? Because it's reflective of what a community can do itself. If a community, what a community does, if we study it, and if the community analyzes it and replicates it, that it empowers itself. If it depends on 7 and 8 to provide theoretical frameworks that are developed based on somewhere else and someone else's work, then it's not going to lead to an end of exploitation. Think about this in academic knowledge construction. The very act of writing a research paper is an act of exploitation. Now, why do I say this? Not because research per se is a bad thing, but research as it is practiced in the exploited countries is modeled as if we want to do research here. Now, research, when it happens at the University of Sydney or Melbourne or at NYU or Oxford or any of these elite universities, what do these professors do? They'll go out into their own communities and support their communities. And they theorize that work, and that theorization becomes models that we assume we need to read and imitate so that we can become like them. How can that be possible when our conditions are totally different? We are different people with different ways of doing things. It's not possible. So, studying 3 to 4, developing understanding of 3-4. How is it that academic discourse in Filipino English evolves? Why is it that we don't look at that? We look at features of variations in domain 1 and domain 2, but we don't look at features of variations of how we use language in domains 3 and 4 for specialized purposes. And if we don't do this, if we don't work here, we will keep losing our opportunities, and we will let the process of exploitation continue. That's the problem. And I think World English has done a lot of great work for us. It has brought us to a point where we can talk about these things. But as a community of World English experts, we need to sort of also think about where do we want to go next. If we want to keep describing 1 and 2, where does it lead us? Where does it actually apply? What do you actually do with these descriptions? What do you do with a morphological analysis of an X variety of English? Not that it's not interesting, it's very interesting, academically perhaps. But is it something that you're doing? And that's the problem with the nature of a research paper. If you turn that into a research project, I think it's fantastic. A research project is where you don't think about what the theory says, what the literature says. You don't think about what dead white people say. You talk about what your community needs, and you create a project around it, and you report on what you did and what you achieved. Rather than reporting on attitudes of what people like and what people don't like, you create projects where you try to change that approaches, and then report on how you try to change it and what happened. And you use that to give lessons and sharing lessons so that we build a world which is a stronger place for all of us, for our communities in our local communities. Because that's where the power has to be. If the power stays in English, because that's typically domain 7 and 8 is typically English, then we're always going to chase a yardstick or something, I don't know, carrot, chasing a carrot. You know the story of chasing the carrot? The horse, the buggy, right? It's always trying to chase the carrot, you will never get it. That's the problem with the way that we have been doing things, I think. And that's part of where we are, because we're doing so much work. We get these conferences every year, we have a journal, we have so much work, and yet we cannot make a real impact on the local communities that we are a part of. And I think that's the limitation and also the opportunity. Anyway, you've been telling me it's time's up, so I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.